Without further ado, Dr. Albert Mohler, a great man of God, and we're blessed to have him here. Thanks, brother.
Well, thank you so much. It is an honor to be here, and what a wonderful evening already. I appreciate Megan so much for her incredible encouragement to us tonight, and it's been good just to be here for that event, and frankly, to have some issues put on the line that desperately need to be put on the line. So we have done good work already. But I also want to say there's more to be done, and I'm looking forward tonight to some conversation with some rising leaders here in Georgia. We're going to talk about what that means and frankly, what's required of us and the kind of leaders we need and you need in the state of Georgia going forward. Georgia's an interesting place. I spent 4 years here as editor of the Christian Index, 1989 to 1993, and that seems like an entire civilization ago. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and do this. Interesting things have happened in Georgia. I am the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Just keep that in mind. The Methodist evangelist Sam Jones came to Cartersville, Georgia, about a century ago. Famous evangelist, he was a famous revivalist. He was preaching a revival in Cartersville, and this was in a time when that was an entirely community-wide event. And so there was a women's session one morning, and Sam Jones asked how many people were there who were, how many of the crowd were Methodists, and the vast majority were. There was one lady in the back she's a very young lady. She didn't stand. She didn't raise her hand. And so Sam Jones said, well then, dear lady, if you're not a Methodist, what are you? And she said, I'm a Baptist. And then Sam Jones decided to take advantage of the situation, and he said, so what if you're, well, he said, well, why are you a Baptist? And she said, well, all my folks are Baptists. And he said, well, what if all your folks were fools? He said, what would that make you? And she said, oh, I'm Methodist, I guess. I don't mean to say that at the expense of the Methodists. I simply want to say interesting things have taken place in Georgia. And sometimes you have to call out things for what they are. I was not born in Georgia. I was born in Florida. However, I was born in the part of Florida that might as well be an extension of Georgia. That was an entire world ago. I was born in 1959. And the boyhood that I came to know, born in the last year of the Eisenhower administration, just in terms of the last years, it was an amazing time to be born. I was born into the Cold War. And the political dynamic of the Cold War was that you had the democratic West versus the totalitarian USSR, and all the issues basically revolved around that. The times were unashamedly militant. I tell people that when I was a 10-year-old boy, I asked my parents for Christmas for a bazooka. I was given a bazooka for Christmas. It was not unusual for a 10-year-old boy to ask for a bazooka. And the reason was the Montgomery Ward catalog advertised one. My friends and I mostly played war, and I was there. We would go out into the woods, and we had Air Force bases and an Air Force bombing run just near where we were playing, so we had air cover the whole time. American politics in that era was very different than politics now. It demanded something very different. During that time, the main dynamic in what became the late 20th century, the main dynamic was between freedom and totalitarianism in what we now know as the Cold War. And of course, the Cold War did not go away. It has come back with a vengeance in a very different form. But American domestic politics in the 1950s and into the 1960s was just light years different from what it is today. The major political parties were divided over agricultural policies and farm subsidies, between claims of exactly how large or how small the missile gap with the USSR might be, and over marginal tax rates. If you were to ask John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon for their position on some of the hottest issues of our times, they would have no idea what you're talking about. I grew up in a wonderful extended family. I had a wonderful Christian mom and dad, and I was surrounded by cousins and aunts and uncles and 4 grandparents and formidable grandfathers. And I just can't imagine, sometimes it's just an intellectual exercise I play with myself. It's the sheer terror of trying to explain to either of my grandfathers what transgender means. That brings about an almost allergic reaction just imagining the conversation. The times are very different. Many things that are now just a common part of our conversation and very much a part of the culture war and of politics, they were unimaginable just a matter of 50 or 60 years ago, or for that matter, just 20 or 30 years ago, or for that matter, just 20 or 30 minutes ago. George Wallace famously said that there's not a dime's worth of difference between the Republicans and the Democrats. And if he was wrong, he was off by cents. That is to say, in terms of policies, there was no great polarization. There was no great division over fundamental issues of life. No one was debating what marriage was. No one was debating whether or not male meant male and female meant female. And for that matter, the vast majority of Americans were fairly certain that most morality was based in a divinely given morality to which we are accountable. All that began to change. It began to change about the time that I was a teenager and very engaged in these issues. And I'm very thankful I came under the influence not only of Christian parents, but of a wonderful evangelical coalition that surrounded me when I was a teenager. I went through an apologetic crisis, a deep crisis, trying to figure out things. I had school teachers who all of a sudden were atheists. I didn't know atheists existed before, and now I've got 2 of them as public school teachers. We moved from Central Florida to South Florida, which was moving from Birmingham to New Jersey. And in the 1970s, everything that I thought was certain began to come loose, and I was trying to figure out these things. And, you know, as a teenager, you have limited options about where to go for help. And thankfully, the Lord surrounded me with some people who were very, very helpful. One of them was D. James Kennedy, Presbyterian pastor in Fort Lauderdale, who became in many ways a mentor to me. And it was through Dr. Kennedy that I was introduced to Francis Schaeffer. And it was Francis Schaeffer who made very clear that you're looking at a conflict of worldviews, you're looking at a clash of worldviews, and that's what helped me to understand what was going on in the 1970s, the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973, and other things that began to just fall apart in the civilization and pointed to a far deeper issue. And in God's providence, the Lord put me at very young ages in some very interesting places. I was in the Miami Beach Convention Center in 1977 when Anita Bryant organized the movement known as Save Our Children, organized against the first gay rights ordinance in the United States, which had been passed by Miami-Dade County. It was a successful effort. And by the way, she held a giant rally. I went with my parents to this rally in the Miami Beach Convention Center, where both the 1972 Democratic and Republican conventions had been held just a few years before. And she invited a preacher I'd never heard of to be the main speaker for the event. His name was Jerry Falwell. And it was one of the first forays of Jerry Falwell into speaking into these issues, which he did with enormous ability. And he later became a very dear friend, an encourager to me in ministry. But when you go back to 1977 and you look at these issues, if you were to go to the average member of Congress, you were to go to the average state legislator, or you were to talk to a senator or a governor, much less a president of the United States or a major presidential contender, they had no position on any of these issues. And, you know, it's interesting that one of the points I want to make is that throughout most of American history, politicians and government leaders didn't have positions on these issues, and they didn't know they didn't have them. They didn't exist. They weren't a part of the national conversation. They weren't a part of the moral universe. Francis Schaeffer made very clear that the worldview clash is inevitable, and as he prophetically indicated, it would grow ever deeper, and the chasm would grow both wider in terms of definition and deeper in terms of significance. We're now in a position in which it's not just a rebellion against God's law. It's not just a rebellion against the Christian claim of morality and the truth claim concerning even such things as sexual morality. It is now a war on ontology. So you invited me. You're going to get the load tonight. Ontology means being. It's more properly in a biblical theology referred to as creation order. Now here's the thing. We have all of a sudden reached the acceleration of the disintegration of our society in which ontological issues are at stake every single day. They're at stake even in terms of the executive orders handed down by President Trump just over the last few days, indicating, for example, that in his administration there would be two and only two genders. Okay, two and only two genders. And then you'll notice that the president, in his inaugural address, had to define what that meant for people for whom that's an alien concept. Now, that means a man and a woman. And so I, being the technical person that I am, I want to know, okay, what would be the mechanism that the government's going to employ to decide who is a man and who is a woman? I don't know how many of you know that the inauguration day, the Trump administration already had in place a way of determining male and female. Yes, thank God. Well, but what exactly would that be? And I know your minds are going to all kinds of obvious ways that could be. But here's the Trump administration's policy, an official definition. It is that male and female correspond to the gametes present in the baby at birth, otherwise known as sperm and eggs. Okay, so again, I just try to imagine what it would be like to discuss that with my grandfather. But the politics that George Wallace dismissed, saying there's not a dime's worth of difference between the Republicans and the Democrats, that's before we had the realignment of the entire political system. It was at a time when you understand that politics is very significant, and of course it was. I mean, it mattered a great deal who was president of the United States in a time of international crisis such as World War II. To beckon one of my heroes, it mattered a very great deal who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain in the time of Britain's greatest crisis. William Manchester, in his famous biography of Winston Churchill, described exactly what was needed, and his last line in the introduction was this: "In London there was such a man." Makes a lot of difference. It makes a lot of difference these days who is in politics, but it makes a lot of difference for a different reason, because given the divide, given the fact that we are now looking at a war on creation order, given the fact that the issues are now whether a boy's a boy and a girl is a girl, it's not that the tax policy issues have gone away. It's not that they're less important. It's not that agricultural policy has gone away or that it's less important. It's still very important. It's certainly not that foreign policy and national defense have gone away. We are steadily reminded that the enemies are still numerous and powerful and deadly in intent. But it is to say we now ask questions of those who would run for public office that we could not imagine ourselves asking just a matter of a few years ago. It does mean that those who would now represent us in government had better understand what is at stake. And they better be willing to take a stand for what is right and true and, yes, ontological. Thankfully, we are in the United States of America not without hope. And as Megan eloquently said, politics is not beneath our dignity. It is not beneath our calling. It is a part of the stewardship which we are assigned when the Lord said not only that he made us male and female, and not only when he said that we are to enter into marriage and be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, he said we are to exercise dominion. And those Christians who are embarrassed about that are embarrassed about Genesis 1. And at least a part of taking dominion means taking the advantage and responsibility and stewardship of the political openings that arise at any particular moment. And right now we understand this stewardship is urgent. And to deny it is to deny a basic area of responsibility the Lord has invested in us and assigned to us. So let's ask the question, who in the world is going to do this? Who is going to run for office? Who is going to serve in these offices? Who is going to take the risk of entering into a political battle and into a political tumult in a time when, quite frankly, we're not just looking at Republicans versus Democrats or Democrats versus Republicans. We're not just looking at liberals versus conservatives and conservatives versus liberals. We are looking at ontological conflict, and the consequences are so great and the stakes are so high that both sides understand it. It's our responsibility to raise up those who are leaders in our midst, who actually believe what we believe, and who actually understand these issues and will apply their convictions in public office, in laws, in decisions, in appointments, across the entire range of political responsibility. If this does not happen, and if we do not seize this initiative now, our grandchildren will understand that it was our failure that led to the collapse of the hope that we could return to and hold fast to the things which endure, the truths that both transform and are permanent. Our task is to contend for permanent things in an age which is at war with permanent things. So this responsibility will not last forever. I am a Christian theologian you have invited into your midst, and I want to tell you that the United States of America is not the kingdom of Christ. We are awaiting a perfect kingdom under the lordship of an infinitely perfect king. But that is not to say that we do not have an irreducible, non-negotiable, non-delegatable responsibility in this age to seek for a government that would rightly align with what is good and beautiful and true. So let's ask some questions and find out who is rising up to take the responsibility in the generation yet to come. I am not sure exactly how to transition to this next point. So let's just forget the transition and do this thing.